Ron.
Baruch haba, welcome everyone to our discussion of Derek Tfunos by Ramchal. As usual, we try to give a bit of orientation. The Sefer can be a little bit daunting when you first go through it with all its chalukim and its parts, but as the Ramchal said in many places, he really organizes material in a very thorough way. And what he says is that he's saying nothing new. He's just telling you what there is. So when we're talking about learning the Gemara, he is describing the process. And there may be a lot of halakim, a lot of different parts, but they're really very logical. And once you hear them, you say, oh yeah, that's obvious. But what's beautiful is that you have a complete whole in which to put all your different methods of thinking. So the Ramchal has explained that there's a debating process in the Gemara, mas and matan, of saying statements and asking kashas and terutzim and bringing proofs. And he said that all this mas and matan, those 7 different types of debating principles, which we spoke about, all are based on very, very simple rules of communication that go on in your mind. And that's what he calls the Yesodot Chelkei Hasugyos Papulas HaSeichel. The foundation of the various debating moves in the Gemara are all founded on 3 basic Pulas HaSeichel, 3 basic logical processes. And what are those 3 processes? So he explains the first one is to understand statements, Havanas Memorim. The second one is to build 2 statements and produce a third one called Hekashim, or syllogisms. And the third one is called Kabbalah Hadeos V'Hashasan, which means to accept an opinion and to reject it. On what basis do you bring proof or disproof? We're in the first section, which is the section about Lamarim. And we've already discussed the first part of that section, which is the various types of statements. And in a statement, he explained, is broken down into Nosei and Nasu, Nosei and Nasu, subject and predicate. And the subject has 3 parts, the all, the particular, and the sum. And we discussed that the predicate has 11 parts, and we went all through them. The last class that we did is we explained what the Sof Kavanah, what's the bottom line meaning of the 11 statements, and therefore what would you need to establish or to disprove those statements? And we went through all the 11 types. This little section over here warns us that we have to recast our statements and make sure that we're either talking in a simple Peshat meaning or in some sort of remez meaning, because the disproof of a statement that's talked in a remez or a mashal, for instance, if I say a lion came up from Babel, and I meant a lion of a man called Rev Kahana, so you don't disprove that statement by disproving the Peshat that there's no lions in Babel. You have to disprove that statement by its meaning, which is Rev Kahana. So that's what the Darkei Dibo part of this chart is. Okay, now we're up to this element. We're going to discuss what he calls Archei HaMamarim, taking 2 statements, juxtaposing them, putting them next to each other, and then going through a scale of saying, are these 2 statements totally alike, domin, or are they totally unrelated to each other, nivdalin, or do they have a relationship with each other, which are either that they share the same subjects and predicates, or they're the opposites of each other, or they're converses of each other. The subject will switch with the predicate. Or does both subject and predicate, are they opposites? Okay, that's what we're going to do today. We're going to take statements. The Ramchal is going to take us through comparative statements and show us how to define whether the statement is saying, the two statements are saying the exact same thing, unrelated, or the variations in between. So that's where we're holding in today's little class. This is Perek Daled, the fourth chapter, and let's start. Hine, ad hena ba'arnu mashanovim b'mamarim kol echad b'nei atzmo. Up to this point, we're talking about individual statements and how to understand an individual statement isolated from every other statement. Ata, now, niva'er mashanevin me harich mamar ima mamar acher. What you can understand by juxtaposing one statement with the next. In the aspect of their worth and their relationship, which he's going to explain. The as far as statements are concerned, when we compare them and we relate them, there'll be 6 different types of statements, pairs of statements that we can speak about. The first are called domim, 2 statements that are comparable. Mischalfin, 2 statements which are variants of each other. Mischabchin, hefchin, 2 statements which are opposites of each other. Chilufin, converses, obverse. Mishabchin and Nibdalim have nothing to do with each other. Okay, now let's go through these 6 categories. Notice the Ramchal always introduces the 6 names, and then he goes and explains each one of them. So you get a broad overview of what he's doing, and then you go into the pratim. The first group is called domim. What are domim? 2 statements that are domim, similar. Shnei mamarim she'amru nosu echad b'nosei echad atzmo, ela ba'ofen ha'amira v'seda hadiber yet mischalfin. It's 2 statements that actually have the same subject and predicate, but the manner in which they're spoken, or the order in which they're said, are different. So you're going to see 2 different, what l'chora is 2 different statements, but when you investigate them, you'll see that they're actually similar. O she'amru nasu echad, or the 2 statements can share the same predicate. O shnei nasuin domim, or 2 predicates which are similar. B'shtei nosim domim, with 2 subjects which are similar. O sheyamru shnei nesuin domim b'nosei echad. So I made, or we're going to have the 2 statements. They're both going to have 2 similar predicates, and they're going to have exactly the same subject. So I made a little chart here. Here's our nosei nosu. Now remember, these are domim. So any switches that go on between subject and predicate really are going to be inconsequential, because really they're saying the same thing, even though they're using different words. And he's going to give examples of that. But just this little chart, we have 3 different possibilities. We can have that the subject and the predicate are mischalfin. They really are totally different. However, even though they're different, they are similar. That's the first group that he spoke about. The second group, he said that the subjects are both domim in the verse, in the 2 statements we're dealing with. However, the predicates are either exactly the same, they're echad, or they're also domim. Okay? So there we have 2 statements that are, again, saying the same information, but really the subject and predicates are not the same, they're just equivalent, or the predicate is the same, or the predicate is exactly the same, and the subjects are different. The third variation, he says, is where the subjects are identical, they're echad, and the predicates are both similar. Okay, so if we just think about the group here, he's really telling us that two statements which are totally different, that's the first group. In other words, the subject and predicates have nothing to do with each other, l'chora, I mean in black and white. They could be really domain because when you get to the real meaning of them, they come out to be saying the same thing. Or we can have the subject's domain and the predicates equal, or domain, or the predicate's domain and the subject equal. Okay, those are all the possibilities. Let's go through some of the examples. By the way, this little chapter of comparing statements is very, very, very important, because whenever you have two statements, you want to make sure that they're complementary and not contradictory. If they're contradictory, we're going to be asking a kasha. That's why this is the foundation of asking a kasha. If we're bringing a proof, then the last statement in the proof should be equivalent to the statement we want to prove. If it's not, then we're going to also be able to disrupt the proof. So when we compare statements, it's very, very important to understand how statements are compared. Are they equivalent statements or not equivalent? Okay, so this is the first part. Two statements which are really equivalent. Here's some examples. Kesha Omru. The Gemara in Kesuba says, Rebbe Yehuda v'Rebbe Dosa Omru Doda Echad. Both Rebbe Yehuda and Rebbe Dosa said the same thing. Now, obviously, they didn't say the same exact words, because then we don't need two people saying the same thing. But they said different things, but their intention is exactly the same. So let's look at what Rebbe Yehuda said. Rebbe Yehuda said in a Mishnah, if a female captive is ransomed, she is deemed a virgin, even if she's an age. So we have a woman that was a shvuya, that was a captive, and he says that she's considered a virgin. She was not raped by the captors. Okay. Came along Reb Dosa, and he said that in a brisa, shvuya ochelas b'truma. A shvuya can eat truma now. A shvuya, obviously we're talking about either a bas Kohen or the wife of a Kohen who was captured. She comes back home and she can also eat truma. So the only way that she could eat truma is if she was not considered raped by her captors. So we see that even though these subjects and predicates are really talking about different things, the intent of both of them is to say exactly the same thing, that a captive woman is not considered to have been raped by her captor. So that's the example of the first type. We're talking about a shvuya, and the other one would the other no-say was a shvuya, which was a kahanas, and the first statement said that shvuyas are considered not to have been raped, and the second statement was talking about kahanas, was a totally different subject, and a totally different predicate because it's talking about her eating truma, but since the only one that could eat truma is one that was not raped by the captors, so they came out to be the same thing. So hine afal pi shemilosein shavos afal pi she'ein milosein shavos. Even though these two statements do not have the same words, timsa kavana samechad. We'll see that they're comparable because their kavana is totally the same. V'chein. There's another example. Pesachim.
So
It says, yes.
It's an example of mischalfim of this first type?
Yes, because they're talking about two different subjects and predicates. One is talking about a stam shuya, that's a basula, and the other one that wasn't, that's not considered to be raped. And the other one's talking about a bas kahanas, or the wife of a Kohen, and that she could eat truma. So both subjects and predicates really are different completely. But when you investigate the self-kavanah. So the intention of both, it comes out that really the second statement is saying what the first statement is saying. That it must be that you consider a woman who is captive not considered to have been raped by the captors. Okay?
Yes.
Let's go to our second example. This is example in Pesachim. A little bit complicated, but it says Rabbi Yochanan ben Brokia and Rabbi Nechemia onu davar echad. Both Rabbi Yochanan ben Brokia and Rabbi Nechemia said the same thing. U'mesayim sham v'ho aninas kalahache zrika dam habe. And the Gemara says, even though we're talking about different subject matter, there the aninus is like after zrika. Okay, so Baruch Hashem, we explained this little complex example there in the Gemara, and we'll explain it again. The Gemara says that both Rabbi Yochanan ben Brokia and Rabbi Nechemia said the same thing. Now, Rabbi Yochanan ben Brokia said that if someone owns a Pesach, a Korban Pesach, and he became metame, became defiled, became impure, even after the sprinkling of the blood on the Mizbeach, after the Korban was offered properly and they did Zrika Sadam, so, which is a very late stage that he became Tameh. In other words, all the procedure was done, and the only thing, and even the Zrika Sadam was done, and then all of a sudden he became Tameh. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Brokia says, I'm sorry, the animal has to be nisraf. You cannot use it anymore. Rabbi Nechemia, what did he say? He said Aaron's Korban Chatos was burnt immediately because of the aninus, because of the bereavement that he had undergone with the loss of his sons. The Gemara concludes by telling us that what these cases, even though they're talking about different subjects and predicates completely, again, are really talking about the same thing. Why? Because the first case, the second case of the sin offering of Korban Chatos that Aaron brought, even though it's talking about he brought it before he got Netama, before the last stage, still that can be compared to the Korban Pesach we're talking about, which the Tameh happened after the Zrika Sadam. The Gemara says that these two subjects are comparable, even though they're not the same. So we're talking about the Korban in both cases being pasul, and we're talking about two different types of people, but the Gemara compares the two because it says that when someone is tameh in the Korban Chatas, even before Zrika Sadam, that's equal, that's Aaron's case, that's equal to the Korban Pesach even after, the Korban Pesach, the Korban Pesach, yeah, even after. Now, even though both these, the actual Tameh happened, the process of being the Tameh happened 2 different times. In our Korban Pesach, it happened after, and after the sprinkling of the blood, and in Aaron's case, it happened before. The Gemara says that they are equivalent. Okay, so again, we've compared 2 different apples and oranges here, 2 different situations, but Sof Devar, they're really, the Gemara says the 2 cases are equivalent. So, Hine, Ein Shnei Inyanim Shem Echad, Ella Dom Zelizeh. So these 2 cases of Aaron and the Korban Chatas are not, they don't have the same shame. They're not talking about the same item, but they're both comparable to each other. So he doesn't go through all the combinations, but that's what it is. So whenever you check out statements, the whole statement can be subject and predicates have nothing to do with each other in 2 statements, but when you plummet to the essential meaning, it turns out to be the same. Or you can be talking about the same subjects. The predicates can be domen. You can talk about the same predicates. The subjects can be domen. Sof Kavana is that they are equivalent. So that's the first type. That's Doman. Okay. Now we're going to talk about Mischalfen. Now Mischalfen, what we're going to do is we're going to keep one of the elements the same, and we're going to change the other element. What do I mean one of the elements? Here's, I made a little chart to get us involved. We're going to keep either the nosei the same and change the nasu, or we'll keep the nasu the same and change the nosei. Okay, so that's why the nosei here is davar echad, and we're going to change the nasuin, or we're going to change the subjects completely. They will not be equivalent to each other, totally different, but the predicates will be the same. Let's hear the Ramchal explain that. Okay, so this is different. The first case, all four boxes, the nosei and the nasu, even though they were different, turns out to be the same. Here, we're going to actually say different subjects or different predicates in the two statements being presented. Let's go for it. The nosei echad. So he says like this: there's two statements that say the nosei echad shnei nesuin mischalfen. You have the same subjects in the both statements, but both predicates of the statements are different. Or, alternatively, nasu echad. You have the same predicate, but you have different subjects. B'shnei nosim mischalfen. So there's a little chart, and here's some examples of the Ramchal. Rabbi Tarfon Omer. Rabbi Tarfon says, Nostan la hakol truma. The person who wants to give, the Kohen who wants to feed his wife, is allowed to give his wife food which is all truma. You can feed her with 100% truma. Doesn't have to feed her with any chulin at all. Comes along Rabbi Akiva and he says no. He has to feed his wife, same subject, michetzi chulin, umichetzi truma. He has to feed her with half chulin and half truma. So we have the same subjects. What do you do with the Kohen's wife? And we have different predicates. Rabbi Tarfon says you can give her 100% truma, and Rabbi Akiva says no, you have to give her half truma. So they have different predicates. Okay, very good. So that was called variance. We're going to where we kept. Yeah, go ahead, please.
That's machlekes, you know, Tarfon Rabbi Akiva in that case?
Yes, definitely. 100%.
So that,
Now,
right, so
not every, okay, yeah. Not
so
every
case
difference, oh, very good.
is machlekes.
No, every case is not a machlokes in variance. Okay?
Okay.
Here it happens to be, but it doesn't have to. A variant, if I say that, if I say Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest Navi, and I say Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah on Har Sinai, so those two predicates are variations of each other, but they're not contradictory.
Right, that's right.
Okay, they don't have to be. Now we're going to be talking about contradictions in the next section. So that's but they could be. They could be. So not every variant is a contradiction. Okay, not every variant. They could be complementary. Okay, let's go to the contradictions. That's what you're talking about. So he's going to give us a few different types of contradictions. Hefchim hem, she'omru al nasu echad benose echad, hein echad hen ve'echad lav. When you have two statements that have the same subjects and predicates, and what changes is the gezerah. One says the predicate, for instance, is there, and the other one says the predicate is not there, then you have a contradiction. Okay? So I have my little chart here. You have two subjects, and one says the predication is there, and one says the predication is not there. So that's a contradiction. Derech mashal. Rabbi Gamliel, Omer, ein get acher get. Velo mama acher mama. Chacham yomim, yesh get acher get, veyesh mama acher mama. Okay, I'm talking about a Yavama who has two wives fallen to him? And what's the din if he gives two gittin to both of them? Or he says mamer to both of them, accepts mamer, and mamer's the state before you from both of them. So Rabbi Gamliel says, ein get acher get. In other words, the second one has no halachic change. Only the get happened to the first one, not to the second one, and the mamer happened to the first one, not to the second one. The Chachamim say, no, both of them are now, as if they both received the get. That means they'd be usher to relatives, or they both receive mamar. So here, we have a particular, and one is saying, in this particular, if a person gave a get after a get, and the other one saying, excuse me, the halacha is that there's no effect of giving two gets. And the second one says there is an effect of giving two gets. Okay, so what we have is really the same predicate here, the giving of two gets by the Yivam giving two gets, and we're saying that that's the same subject. And what happens is that it has an effect or it doesn't have an effect. It's a machlokas. So he gave actually examples here of two klaulim, or two pratim, which I'll explain later, and he negated what we call the gzera. Okay. Now, remember, we have the nosei, the nasu, the subject and the predicate. The gezerah means, is it mekayem or sholel? Is it affirming something or denying something? Okay, so when it comes to the opposites, we have same subject and predicates, and one, the predicate is affirmed, and one, the predicate is denied. Now, he gives us a very important note here. V'ulam, keshiyakro hefchinim, tzarich sheyeh nesu'am echad v'nos'am echad. If two statements are really going to be called opposites, then both their subjects and predicates must be equivalent. V'yuvan b'zman echad, they both, even if they are equivalent, they have to be in the same bechina of zman, they have to be talking at the same time, or in the same bechina of makom, b'makom echad, in the same place, b'bechina echas, any bechina, any one of the bechinas that we can think about, any one of the different ways that we're going to later on is going to explain exactly all the different types of bechinas, but any type of aspect that we look at, if it's going to be true hefchim, then the subjects have to be talking about the same exact aspect. V'havanas peshuta bli shum shuta v'hashala. The statements also, to be opposite, have to both be understood in their simple meaning, and there cannot be any ambivalent terms. In other words, a term that can have the same term can have two different meanings. I think we call them synonyms. Okay, they can't have any synonymous terms. Or hashala, one can't be talking about, as we said with Rav Yochanan, talking about a lion coming up for battle. One's talking about Rav Yochanan was called the lion, and the other was talking about a physical lion. So we have to be very careful that we have the same subject and predicate. It also is talking about the same aspect. Now it's going to explain that out a little. Perish. Kihine hamamra lo teitze isha lo bitotefet lo b'san butin v'mamra yotza isha bitotefes u b'san butin einam hefchina. Why? Lefi she'echad hu b'zman she'en tefurim v'asheni b'zman she'hem tefurim. So the two statements here, one that a woman cannot carry or go out on Shabbos, with these crowns on her head, this various jewelry on her head, with the statement that she can go out with these various forms of jewelry on her head, are not opposites. They look opposites because they're talking about the same term, and one is affirmative and one is denial, but they're not. Why? Because when we said that she can go out, that's when they're sewed into her hair, so she won't be taking them off. And when did we say she can't go out? That's when they're not sewed into her hair. So we're talking about a different bechina, two different aspects. So even though the subjects are the same, since we're talking about two different aspects of that subject, sewing and not sewing, so we don't say that the statements are contradictory. Okay. Now, again, it's very important to know this. When we get to a kasha, we give a teretz, what do we do many times? What we do is we change a bechina, and we say, really, there's no contradiction. Because in this aspect, if we were talking about the statement, the Sanbuten, or let's say the Totafos, whatever, the jewelry is really not contradictory to the statement that says one statement says mutter, one says it's also, because we're talking about different aspects. So we get rid of contradictions by changing the aspects. What we say in the world, they say, when faced with a contradiction, make a distinction. So we make a distinction. This is talking about one aspect of the text. V'chein, in Shabbat, it says, V'lo b'kavul im yotzek b'kavul. Two statements, again, that seem to be contradictory. She can go out with this hairnet or kavul with the statement that she can't. Okay. Why are they not contradictory? Because where can she go out? That's the Rishus Rabban. That's the makom where she can't carry this object in her hair out. But where can she go? She can go to her Chatzer, which is not a Rishus Rabban. So those two statements, although the words seem contradictory, same terms and a different gezerah, they're really not, because they're talking about two different places. V'chein b'shat t'naim shezacharnu. So it is with all the other conditions that we mentioned. Okay, time, place, etc. V'chein mamar, here's a mamar in a Reuven. It says, V'im toka chayev chatos. If a person blows, he has to bring the chatos. Eino hefchi lamarma tekiya shofar v'ridiyas hapas chachmehi v'eino malacha. With the statement that the blowing of the shofar and the taking the pas out of the tanur, the bread out of an oven, that's not considered, it says chachma, it's not considered a malacha. Well, if it's not a malacha, if the kiyah shofar is not a malacha, so why you chayiv chatos? It's a contradiction. The first statement says, if a person does taka, he's chayiv chatos. But we see that taka, the shofar, is not chayiv chatos. So even though they're both talking about the word taka, they're not going to be contradictions. Why? Ki havanas harishon hu tekiyas hatzir b'chor shelo. When we said in taka chayiv chatos, we're talking about taking a peg into a very little hole and banging it inside. Okay, but when we're talking about the second type of tekiah, that was tekiah shofar. So that's a question of a word having a synonymous word. The word tokeah they sound alike, but they have two different meanings. One is tekeah, blowing a shofar, and one is taking a blow and banging a peg into a hole. So we have to be very careful, and that's another way, by the way, to get out of contradictions, by saying that even though the terms are the same, they have double meanings. Okay?
Isn't this example talk a little bit like simplistic for the Ramchal? Because I mean, it's obvious that they're not the same thing. If one is talking, meaning that you're attaching something, one is talking that you're blowing a shofar, then obviously they're not talking about the same thing.
Right, but the second term is clearly saying tekiah shofar, right? The first term doesn't tell you what type of taka it's talking about.
Well, I guess you have to see the context, no? It's
Yeah.
not obvious in the context what it is?
Okay, it could be obvious in the context, and you wouldn't have a kasha, but it's sometimes not. A lot of the Rabbeinu Chaim, what does he do, Rabbeinu Chaim, a lot of the times? he changes, he says zwei din. He says the subjects here are different. They look similar, but they're not. Okay? So, although sometimes in these examples it may be clearer than other times. At other times, you think you're talking about the same subject, and you see that, wait a minute, they have different dinim. So he has to say, no, these are different subjects. Okay? So, that's one of the ways we get rid of contradiction, by saying that the subject that you thought were the same, because they sound the same, they have the same name, really are different. Okay, so that's the first note that he says on contradiction, that the terms must be understood in their simple form, not any type of remez, no lions coming up from Babel, no ambivalent terms, okay, I mean banging or blowing, giving a blow on a hammer and giving a blow on a shofar. Okay, now he says the second rule here, but so sheteda ki behefchim atzmam yesh hefchim mamish shehein min haketzer laketzer v'yesh einam hefchim kol kach af al kol panim machishim zeh et zeh v'nikra misnadim. Okay, they're called contraries and not contradictions. There's certain hefchims that are called hefchim mamish. Okay, they're diametrically opposed. They're 100% in contradiction. Then he has a second category, which he says they're misnagdim. There is contradiction, but it's not a complete contradiction. It's only a partial contradiction. Let's give an example. Shnei mamarim klaliim o shnei mamarim pratiim she'echad yichayev ve'echad yisholer nosu echad b'nosei echad hem hefchiim min haketzer el haketzer. If you have two statements, both these statements are klalim, general. They're both all statements. And you're saying about both these all statements that one predicate exists and the other predicate not. All the Jews have a chelik haolam haba, all the Jews don't have a chelik haolam haba. There's two klali statements, and you're saying they do and they don't have a chelik haolam haba. Or you have two pratim. Okay, you say Shmuel was a king of Israel, and then you say Shmuel was not a king of Israel. So you have two prati subjects. One is affirmative, one is negative. We changed the Gezerah. So those are complete and diametric opposites. Here's some examples that he gives. Kol hakelim notlan l'tzarech u'shelo l'tzarech. Rabbi Nechemia omrim ein notlan ela l'tzarech. Elu shnei mamarim hem hefchim mamish shneim kololim. Both are talking about all kelim. And one is saying that, we're talking about being muksa, and one's saying all kelim can be moved, whether you need them or you don't need them. The other one's saying that all kelim cannot be moved. They can only be moved tzarech. So all kelim can be moved, all kelim cannot be moved. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, those two klalim. Tameya hi lein madliking bo. Rabbi Akiva Omer tahar hi madliking bo. We're talking about this wrapped up wick. One says it's tamei. When you unwrap it, it becomes the shear of tamei. Question is, what is it when it's all wrapped up? So Rabbi Eliezer says this wick is tamei, therefore you can't use it. And Rabbi Akiva says this wick is not this tahor, and you can use it. So you see, that's hefchim mamish shneim pratim. They're talking about this particular wick that's all wrapped up, and one says it's tamei, and one says it's not tamei. So those are two pratim. So when you have two statements, both of them are klalim, and the gezerah changes, yes and no, or two statements that are pratim and the gezerah changes, yes and no, you always have a diametrical contradiction. What's a misnagid? Partial contradiction. Achamamar b'Shabbos that says umitzdarfen zeh zeh mipnei sheshabu b'shoreihen chutz mi klipeihen. All these seed type items, different types of seeds, can be mitzdarf one to the other and make a shear that the person will be over breaking Shabbos if you walk from Shus Yachid. So we mitzdaref, we put all different types together in order to make up the shear, but we don't include the klipos. Okay, so you have orange, pears, and apples. You want to know you have a shear enough to take out for Shabbos, so you subtract the klipa. What about the statement that says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, chutz mi klipa adashim? Because I agree with you in general that we do not count the klipa. We just add all the different types of fruits together. But there's one klipa where I disagree with you on, and that's the klipa of adashim. There we do count it. So they're not hefchim mamish from one end to the extreme opposites, but they're really misnagdim. They're still contradictory, but not total contradictions, partial contradictions. Why? Ki Tanakama omer al kli pasan she'enam mitzdarfen im ochel. The Tanakama said about klipot that they're never mitzdarf with the ochel. If you have different types of food, you never include any types of klipot. Rabbi Yehuda and type of, shells. Peels. Rabbi Yehuda omer al klipas hadashim levadam mitzdarfen im ochel. He says, I agree with you when it comes to all of the types of things. We do not count the klipas, but I disagree with there is one item where we do count the klipa, and that's with lentils. Agrees with one prat. So that's called a misnagid. No, it's not a total contradiction. It means in certain areas there is a contradiction. So that's the next thing that he wants us to ascertain. You can have complete or partial contradictions. The next point. V'tzar sheteda'od shekamo shehem hefki'im השלילה והקיום, כך הם hefki'im shnei inyanim. I just explained to you, says the Ramchal, that if you keep the subject and predicate the same and change the gezerah to hein v'lav, yes and no, you'll end up with a hefech. That's if they're both klalim or they're both pratik. But there's certain times where you don't have to change. You don't have to keep you don't have to say hein v'lav because the terms in the predicate, for instance, will be opposite terms. What does that mean? Because one term by definition denies the other term. Derech mashal. Tameh v'tahor. Hem hefchim. Those are opposite terms. Ki kavana milas tameh hi shlilas tahara. Because the word tameh is the negation of the word tahor. The kavanas tahor shlilas tameh. And the word tahor is shlilas of tameh. So you don't have to see the statement. The statement does not have to say this is permitted and X is permitted and Y is not permitted. It could just say that, in other words, say hein v'lav, it just say that this is tameh. The other one says this is tahor, and even though the terms that look like they're different, they're opposite terms. So that's note number 3, to make sure that you don't concentrate only on yes and no. Certain times you have terms which are opposite terms. Note number 4.
So the point, so the point
Yes,
is, so the
please.
point is again, he's getting back to because it's an inference really. That you have two different terms, but you have to look at the inference of the terms and understand that they're really opposites, even though it's not it's a clear opposite.
That's correct. Even though it doesn't say yes and no, once you, as you say, investigate the term and what it really means, what you can infer from the term, one term infers the opposite of the other term. Oh, very good. Okay. Note number 4. אמנם צריך שתדע שיש הבחיים שביניהם אמצעי והבחיים שאין ביניהם אמצעים. Now we have another very interesting point here. He says that sometimes you have opposites that have a middle point, and sometimes you have an opposite that doesn't have a middle point. Let him explain. דרך משל, טמא וטהור עשה ומותר. אין ביניהם אמצעי. When you talk about tamei and tahor or asa mutar, there's no middle point. There's no middle ground. Either something is tamei or something is tahor. If it's not tamei, it's tahor. If it's not tahor, it's tamei. Either something is asa or it's mutar. It's not asa, it's mutar. If it's not mutar, it's asa. There's no midpoint between. Those are called really diametric terms. Reshut v'chovah, but the concept of a reshut and a chov, yesh b'neihem emsa, shehu mitzvah, does have a midpoint, which is a mitzvah. A chova means you absolutely must do it. On the other end of the scale, you have a reshut. You can do it. Well, you don't have to do it. There's no compulsion. You want to eat eggs, you can eat eggs. You don't have to eat eggs. What's in the middle? You have a mitzvah. A mitzvah is not a chova, but if you do it, you get a mitzvah. It's not just a pure reshus. Now, he doesn't go into a further explanation of this point, but this is a very, very important little note, because when it comes to diametric terms, the affirmation of one is the negation of the other, and the negation of one is the affirmation of the other. In other words, if I say something is asr, then by definition it's not mutar. If I say something is mutar, it's not asur. If I say something is not asur, it is mutar. And if it's not mutar, it is asur. Those are diametric opposites. The affirmation of one is the denial of the other. The denial of one is the affirmation of the other. But when I have a middle term, so then the denial of one is not the affirmation of the other. For instance, if I say hot and cold, okay? I say this is hot. I affirm it's hot. I affirm it's hot. It definitely is not cold. But say I deny it's hot. I say it is not hot. Does it mean it's cold? No, it could be lukewarm. It could be lukewarm. So the affirmation of a term which has a middle term is denial of the opposite extreme. In other words, if I say it's hot, it's definitely true that it's not cold. But the negation of the opposite term, if I say it's not hot, does not mean that it's cold. It doesn't mean the affirmation of the other side, because it could be the middle. So that's a distinction that's very important to note between opposite terms, whether they have a middle or not.
So by resus, so you could say something is resus, yet it could still be a mitzvah, and those are not opposites.
If I say something is a reshus, it's definitely not a mitzvah. The question is, if it's not a reshus, what is it? In other words, the affirmation of a reshus is definitely, it's not a chova, it's not a mitzvah. That's the affirmation of reshus. Okay, I say it is a reshus, but the negation is the problem. That's where we're going to have a problem. If it's not a reshus, it doesn't mean it's a chova. It could be that it's a mitzvah. Okay. So that's where the difference will come in. And the negation of one pole is not the affirmation of the other. Okay. Od yesh ma'amarim she'echad. Okay, so that's the end of his discussion of opposites. Okay, that was for the Ramchal, quite a lengthy discussion, but very, very, very significant discussion. Now we're going to go to what's called Chilufim. And we'll handle this technically, although there's a very, very deep logical point here when I do a Chiluf. So let's just talk about it simply first, and we'll begin to analyze what the deeper logical inference is. Okay, he says like this: O yesh mamrim she'echad hu chilufo mamash shel chavaro. We have another type of juxtaposition of two statements, where one statement is the converse of the other statement. Perish, what does that mean? Shemashahu no se be'echad ye nasu b'sheni. What was the subject of the first statement? It turns out to be the predicate of the second statement. Umashuhu nasu be'echad ye nasu no se l'sheni. And what was the predicate of one of the statements? Turns out to be the subject. So the subject and the predicate will switch places. That's called the chiluf. The subjects and predicates switches. Derech mashal. Kesh omru, it says in Yerushalmi, Rabbi Yochanan Omer, ein avera mitzvah. And Rabbi Yossi Omer, ein mitzvah avera. So we see here that the subject of the first statement, which was avera, turns out to be the predicate of the second statement. And the predicate of the first statement, mitzvah, turns out to be the subject of the first statement. So they switch places. That's called the converse. Now he's going to go through three different variations of the converse statements. Hine be'echad, and he spells it out first. Hine be'echad avera, he knows that, mitzvah nasu, ub'sheni hefech. So in the first statement, the avera is the subject. The avera is the subject. And mitzvah is the predicate. It should be a comma. Okay. Okay. Yeah. And in the second one, then, excuse me, let's get that straight. Hine be'echad avera he no say. Mitzvah is the nasu. Good. The subject is avera, and the predicate is mitzvah, and the sheni is just the opposite. Very good. Well, now he's going to say, Ulam hachiluf hazeh yochol liyos b'shlosha drachim. He's now going to give us three different ways that this converse statements can happen. So I made a little chart, and really what's going to happen is we're always going to have, my chart has seder, that means does the subject and predicate switch places. It has commas, which means are the subjects both, does the subject switch from an all to a some, or from all to a prod, or from some to an all? That means the commas. Remember, in subjects you have all, some, and particular. Do they switch between two statements? Then you have the predicate, which is always going to switch in both statements to have a chiluf, and the subject is always going to change in the two statements, going from subject to predicate, and the predicate is always to change from two statements. And finally, the gezerah is the statement Makayim. Is it a is statement or an is not statement? So those are going to be the various combinations of converses. In all of the three variations he's going to bring, of course, the subject is going to switch with its predicate. Okay, that's going to be common in all chilufo. That was what was the subject to the predicate was the predicate. It becomes a subject in two statements. What he's going to play with now is whether the commas changes in both statements or the gezerah changes in both statements. Okay, and these are going to be the three combinations. Just as a note before we get into the pratim, the deeper psychological meaning of these conversions is that you're talking about the difference in relationship. In one statement you're saying, we talk about a subject's relationship to a predicate, In the other statement, you talk about the predicate's relationship to a subject. That's a different logical relationship. The statements are related because they're talking about same subject and predicates, but one is talking about the subject's relationship to the predicate, and one's talking about the predicate relation to the subject. I'm not going to get any deeper into that, but I'm going to leave that for food for thought. That's the deeper meaning of converses. So now let's go through the chart. Echad. She yischalev haseder perush and osimenos. So the first one, which is going to be common in all of them, is where we change what he calls the seder, the subject and predicate switches from two statements. But what happens in the first type? V'tishaer hakamus. We leave the commas alone. Perish. She'im haya klali yishar klali. If the statements were klali statements, they remain statements. V'im haya prati yishar prati. The subjects stay the same amount. V'chena gezerah. If they were both perish. Im yemamar im haya mekayim yishar mekayim im yisholel yishar yisholel. If the statements were positive statements, both of them, they stay positive. If they were negative statements, they stay negative. So the only thing that changes in the first set is the nosei and the nasu. That's the only thing that changes. Everything else, that's the commas, and the gezerah stays the same. Let's give an example. Shnei mamarim. Ein avera mitzvah, ve'ein mitzvah vera. There we see the chiluf, this change of places between avera and avera, and mitzvah. They both change places, but we left the commas alone. Ein. There are none. And gezerah also. So there are. If you want to recast the statement, we could say there's no avera that is a mitzvah, and there is no mitzvah that is a avera. They're both makayim, and they're klali statements. The only thing that switched was the subjects and predicates. Next type. The sheni.
Why did you call them makayim and not a shalom?
I know, exactly, because it looks like a shola, right? Because the word ain, right?
Because it's saying a zera is not a mitzvah. And a mitzvah is not an avera.
Yeah. So what I did was I changed this word to avera, and I said all averas, and this is what we should really discuss. Is there a difference by saying there is no avera that is a mitzvah and saying all averas are not mitzvahs? Is there any difference in those two statements?
It's the same thing.
Yeah, the same thing. So I think in order to make the distinction clearly, what we're negating, I would rather, even though it says ein avera, right, there's no avera, really, if I say what's the subject there, I'm really saying all averas, and this ein is really going on mitzvahs. I'm really saying all averas are not mitzvahs. So although stylistically you have an ein in front of the subject, I think the kavanah is more clear to say that all averas are not mitzvahs. We're not predicating a mitzvah of any avera. And the other statement, we're not predicating any avera of any mitzvah. But this is, again, food for thought. These are the type of things that you should think about in your spare time. Okay, but I think that's the way to make the subject and predicate clear in this case, not to get confused. Okay. That's the first type. The first type is where we're changing nothing, not the commas. They're both klali statements. We're not changing gezerah, where they're yeah, we're not changing gezerah. They're both negative.
Right.
Or exactly. One isn't exactly. And they're both negative in both cases. So we left everything the same. Very good. The second type, sheyischalev haseder v'gam hakamos. Here we're going to change the seder. Of course, we do that all the time. And also the commas, which we didn't change before. But the gezerah, tiskayim, we're going to leave the gezerah alone. Okay, so that's going to be the second type. Right? Look at my little chart here. Of course, all of them we said are going to change the seder between the nosei and the nasu. But in this one, we're going to play with the commas. We're going to change the commas, and we're going to leave the gezerah the same. So let's see how he does that one. Let's say to him, derech mashal. Kol she'eno ochel, eno machil, with the statement yesh she'eno ochel, eno machil. The only thing we changed here was the kol, and the yesh was the gezerah. Kol, everyone in that subject of eno ochel has the predicate of eno machil. Now, yesh, there are some in the predicate of eno ochel that are eno machil. So we left everything alone except, of course we switched subject and predicate, but we changed it from a klali to a kutsasi. She'echad klali v'sheni kutsasi. Let's go through the third variation. She'eschalfu haseder, we do that all the time. V'hagezerah, this time we're going to change the gezerah also, but the commas we're going to leave alone. Let's go back to our little chart over here. In the third type, what's going to change, the only thing that's going to change is the gezerah. It's going to go from yes to a no. We're going to leave the commas the same. If it was klali, it's going to remain klali. Of course, we always switch subjects and predicates. And let's look how that looks. Derech mashal. Kol ha'ochel machil, with kol she'eno machil, eno ochel. Okay, so here we're going to change the gezerah. The gezerah here went from makayim, kol ha'ochel, that's the subject. We're going to makayim, that they're machalim. With the other statement, we say kol she'eno machil. Now we're going to deny here. We're going to change the gezerah. Kol she'eno machil, eno ochel. All the ones that don't machil, they also do not feed. Now, I would have not gone so far, and I wonder why the Ramchal went further than I would have. If we're just going to change the gezerah, right, leave everything the same, so why don't we just say kol ha'ochel machil and kol ha'machil eno ochel. Are you with me there? I don't know why he negated also the subject. Why do you also negate the subject? That's an interesting question that I have. Okay, I don't have a solution to it. Okay, if you just want to change the gezerah, so change. If here it's kol ha'ochel machil, very nice.
You could have said kol
ha'machil changes the predicate comes eno ochel. So that's a question I'm going to leave open. Okay, question, but I don't know it's a deep question. I don't know the answer to that. But the Ramchal doesn't throw words. He's telling us a chiddush here, but I don't know why it went so far. Maybe it includes this case of negating the subject also. I don't know. Okay, so that's the end of Chilufo. I'm just for I know we're going a little over time, but I just want to go through the last two terms. The obverse, the fifth term is called a mishapchim. Hain, osam, shenosehem, v'no, shenosuhehem, v'nosehem, excuse me, their predicates and their subject, shneim hevchim, they're both opposites, v'nimsa inyanim echad. Now here we finished switching around. We're not doing converses anymore. We're back to keeping the Seder exactly as it was. But what we're going to do here is we're going to switch the subjects and the predicates. Okay, so here's the first statement. Derech mashal. Kol ha'ochel machil. Kol she'eno ochel eno machil. So that's pretty good. What he's saying here is, here's the subject in both cases, the word ochel. And he says, everyone that can kol ha'ochel is also a machil. Okay, we're talking about feeding shum, we'll get into the details of the case. But kol she'eno ochel, now I'm taking the negation. I'm saying the people that are not the subject. Okay, these are all the people who do eat. These are the people who don't eat themselves. Okay, so here the first thing is that all the people that can eat, they can confer the right of eating on others of truma. But all the people that can't eat, they cannot infer the right of eating truma on others. So there, what we did, but the subjects and the predicate are on the same. They're both the same ochels, but one we're saying that all the ochel people can be machil people, and the other one is saying the non-ochel people are not machil people. Okay, so now that relationship is talking about a subject relationship. Whenever I talk about a subject, I say all buses have wheels, or I say all Jews have a chelik in olam haba. Okay? So now what about non-Jews? Okay, that's the negation of the subject. So we're going to learn the Yukud in the next chapter. They could or they could not. There's nothing mukhrach in the first statement. If the statement just says, all Yehudi, every Jew has a chelik, it doesn't really talk about the non-Jews. It's only talking about the cheshes and the kaim of every single Jew has a chelik. But if there would be a second statement, Kol she'eino, all non-Jews don't have a chelik in olam haba, that would be complementary. Okay, that's what he says, she'inyanim echad. That would be complementary to the first statement. Okay, it's not muchrak, but it would be the complement of the first statement. You with me? All Jews have a chelik in olam haba, with all non-Jews don't have a chelik in olam haba. Those two statements would be complementary and not contradictory. Even though they're using contradictory terms, it's not really, because one is talking about the all Jews, and one is talking about the category of all non-Jews. And those are not in contradiction at all, but just complementary. The last category he calls nivdalim. Acham memarim she'ein lehem yachas v'shituv klal, but statements that don't have any relationship to each other, any common denominator at all, pira she'ein, no sehem, the nisu'ehem echad, their subjects and predicates are not at all the same, both subjects and predicates, v'gam lo domim klal, and they're not even comparable to each other, so they're called nivdalim. Whenever we have two statements whose subjects and predicates have nothing to do with each other, so they're nivdalim. And they're talking about there's no relationship between the two. So that's the final set. Now, I made a little chart here. And as I said, these concepts, when you first get to them, they seem overwhelming, not because they're so difficult, but just so many little types. But when you get comfortable with them and you start understanding what's going on, so it becomes less strange and really very, 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 very practical. Here I made a little chart. Maybe I'll send it to you if you like. Here's the 6 types we're talking about: the domim, the mischalfim, the hefchim, and the misnagdim, chilufim, the mishabchim, and the nivdalim. And here I just emphasized what the chains were. Domim, they're talking about different terms altogether, or even if the subjects and predicate are similar, they're talking other things are domim. In other words, they're even talking about different information, but in the self-kavana, they're really saying the same thing. Mischalfin is where the subjects or the predicates are the same and the opposites are different. They may be in contradiction, may not. I could say something is red and black, it's contradiction. Something is red and not red, it's a contradiction. But if I say something is red and something is valuable, they're just mischalfin, they're just different predicates, the same subject, not contradiction. The next one we said was hefchim. They're the opposites. Now they can be diametrically opposed if they're two klalim or two pratim, one saying yes and no, or they could be just misnagdim. One could be a klal and the person's arguing with a prat. The fourth category was this converses, where we switch the positions of the subjects and predicates, and we're either going to leave everything alone except that switch, or we're going to change the commas, or we're going to change the kazera. Those are the 2 variations. And finally, we have this habchim, where we change subject and predicate. We don't change the order. We keep the subject and predicate the same way, but we just change subject and predicate. We said those are complementary. And then we have navdalim. They have no, they're not, they're not at all similar to each other. Just like we said, in the case of you're allowed to takea and you're not allowed to takea, even though it looks as if those are contradictory, there's really no dilemma because one is talking about banging a peg into a hole and the shofar. So that's the end of that very important discussion about how closely related or unrelated statements are. And as we said, that's going to be a critical understanding in whether we have contradictions in statements or not. It's also going to come into proofs, whether one thing really is the proof of something else. It's going to come into syllogisms, because if the two premises of the syllogisms do not have a common term, we're going to have problems with it. So we're going to see it quite a lot. But simply speaking, we use it when in the most base form is contradiction. One pasuk says you can use Shavit Kesef, the other pasuk says you can't use Shavit Kesef, and so on and so forth. Or as he brought here, sometimes it's a marina cloud and a prod, and all these variations. Okay, so that's the end of our discussion of comparative statements, and next week, Bezrat Hashem, will go on to inferences. Inferences that are not said there in black and white, but are understood, as you brought up, opposite terms. It's understood that the negation of the affirmation was the negation of the other because the term is an opposite term. And he's going to go into that whole discussion. Okay, any questions on that rather long shiur? If not, we'll say shalom till next week.